to cut across to Washington, D.C. to the State Department, where India Today's news director Rahul Kamal now joins me for more on this. Rahul, 3 days now, first New York, then Washington, D.C., White House, and now the State Department. While the bells and whistles are all there, the optics are all great, this isn't just optics, this is truly, as both India and the American establishment want us to believe, this is truly substantive. Some of the agreements that have been signed, as the government says, from subsurface to the space.
Oh, absolutely, Gaurav, because I think this whole initiative on critical and emerging technologies has been very significant because the moment the National Security Advisors got onto the conversation, there are a lot of things which would have otherwise got held up in the whole bureaucratic process, whether it is in Commerce Ministry in either country, or it is, say, in the finance ministries of either country, or industry or trade, suddenly have started getting expedited. I've been spending the day talking to a lot of think tankers, a lot of academics here in the United States, and they're saying, just imagine that you've now got a situation where a company like GE, a global MNC, is willing to give at less than commercial rates critical technology which you would sweat over, just trying to build the IP around the technology, to a country that isn't even an alliance partner. Although I do notice that in a lot of the papers, the mainstream American papers, the word ally is being used now while referring to India. And that is important because India isn't an ally of the United States in a treaty sense of the word. And therefore, for people here in the US to constantly talk about India now being an ally just shows how deeply entrenched this relationship has become. Some of the senior officials we were speaking to in the Biden administration, some of these interviews we did, India being referred to a great power or an emerging great power, that again in some senses shows the bet that Washington DC is making on the India story for various reasons: the slowing down of the Chinese economy, the decline of the Chinese workforce, and because of the fact that India has a very young active workforce and more perpetuity value going into the future, shows that this is a very significant bet that these countries have made on each other. And now a visit like this has really forced things through the system. The question is, once this visit ends, once the PM leaves for Egypt, can the rest of the system keep the level of momentum going? That, I think, Gaurav, will then become the key to actually see whether the hype that we've seen this time translates into actual execution on the ground. Gaurav.
In fact, that was the question I was coming to, Rahul. While it's very heartening to hear that GE 414 fighter jet engines would be manufactured in India for Indian Air Force, is there a timeline from the MOU to the actual aircraft engine being manufactured in India?
So I spoke to Ashwani Vaishnav about semiconductors, and he said Micron will start manufacturing in 6 quarters from now. That's just about a year and a half, so that's very impressive if it does happen. But that also, while it's intricate and very complicated, is far less complicated than the jet engine deal. And remember, here there is also Hindustan Aeronautics, which is in the picture, and with all respect to HAL, they're not really known as being the most efficient in terms of getting things done on time. That's just their track record over the decades, and that's the reality that we're dealing with. So this is very sensitive technology which will be transferred. There will be a lot of weeds that you'll have to navigate. And remember the nuclear submarine deal with Australia, the AUKUS nuclear submarine deal, that's still held up in terms of its implementation, not because they don't see the value any longer, but because it's just difficult to get these things done. So yes, of course, there is intent, there are announcements, the execution ultimately will be the key. And I think the Prime Minister has made quite a statement, in the manner in which he's come here, touching all the right buttons, saying the right things, reaching out even to people like Kamala Harris, who've had very uncharitable things to say about the government before she became Vice President, of course, in the manner in which he looked back at her felicitated her at that at the US Congress and then at the State Department luncheon also shows that he realizes that you have to take the entire system along. It's not just the one-on-one chemistry between the heads of state. The whole system needs to be carried along for this intent and for these headlines to translate, Gaurav, into real, cogent, tangible action.
You're absolutely right, and the conversations that were happening, whether with between President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Narendra Modi, or Prime Minister Narendra Modi also referring to Antony Blinken, U.S. Secretary of State, at this state luncheon, saying that you played a key role in taking this relationship forward, and personal comments about his singing talent, and how that too is very good. So it just shows a new kind of bonhomie, or a new bonhomie between India and the United States, Rahul.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I was at lunch at the India Spora event talking to some Indian Americans. Massive clamor. Remember when the French president had come, the representation was much more diverse. Here there were a lot of Indian Americans, and at some level it's also like a mooch ka sawal. Now let's imagine there's some big Indian businessman who's otherwise flaunting his political connections and making it seem as if he's a really big guy, and then he doesn't get invited to the dinner. And everybody around him is asking just that same question, Acha, aap dinner mein nahi the? And somehow whether you got invited or not becomes representative or reflective of that person standing in the scheme of things. So people were just going crazy trying to, and I think the American president also referred to it. So apart from all the officials who are obviously more accessible and you can put more pressure on them, even the American president referred to this when he said that I really had a tough time. People I didn't know existed were calling me, putting pressure, saying that they want to be, and he made this point to Prime Minister Modi when they had met at the G7 summit in Japan. And Prime Minister Modi, in the address that he did at the state dinner where we were last evening, said that I hope you've been able to accommodate. You told me in Japan that you were under a lot of pressure for these passes. I hope you've been able to accommodate them, and I hope everybody who wanted the pass, you've got them here at the tent in the White House. So he was being funny and just cracking a joke. I don't think just at that moment President Biden fully understood the context or the joke, because there's also translation involved. But for the others who were there who understand both Hindi and English, they had a hearty laugh, and the president was kind of amused, wondering what the joke was about. But I think maybe he caught on to it a little later. Gaurav.
Oh, absolutely. And I was speaking to Dr. Jitendra Singh, Minister of State, Science and Technology. He said he's very excited about the space cooperation between India and America, sending a man to the International Space Station by 2024, signing this Artemis Accords. According to him, this will truly be transformational, exploring Moon, Mars, outer space. All of this takes the relationship to a new level, to a new height, he says. Even sky's not the limit, the Prime Minister said, Rahul.
Oh, absolutely. Space station technology. Remember that tech handshake that happened this morning at the White House? The kind of American and Indian corporates that were represented over there? Because a lot of this is really stuff that the government can't do. They can only create an enabling ecosystem, and then the rest of the work is really down to businesses pushing each other, making things happening, making things happen on the ground, which is where the likes of an Anand Mahindra, Mukesh Ambani, Satya Nadella, the CEOs of GE, Boeing, all the big companies that were represented over there, that's where they need to get active and really bite into the promise and the prospect that the India story holds at this time, because the intensity that they show, they can be spoken to, but ultimately money decides on its own. It's not going to happen just because Biden wants or Modi is asking them to come. It has to make sense for them commercially, and only then would they sink their money into actual investments in India. So I think a lot of this is about just building a framework which would allow for companies, individuals, institutions now to take over and run with the baton that the politicians have got started with.